Hi everybody. If you're just coming in, that's fine. Uh, welcome to the presentation on agrivoltaics with John Hay from the UNL Extension Office. Uh, I'm Coda. I'm an AmeriCorps member. I'm with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. Uh, Conservation Nebraska's mission is to just like protect our state's natural legacy. We educate the public, we support communities, we increase civic engagement, and we do that all through locally led education efforts and community engagement projects to just address local conservation concerns and concerns throughout the state. Before we start the presentation, just a little bit of housekeeping. Your cameras are going to stay off. You're going to stay muted. We're not going to unmute anybody. Um, if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat. You can type them in the Q&A section. We'll do the questions after the presentation. Uh, this presentation is going to be recorded and it'll be uploaded to Conservation Nebraska's YouTube page within a couple weeks or so. So if you miss any of it, if you want to go back to something, if you want to send it to other people, you'll just be able to find it on our YouTube page. And after the presentation, we're gonna have a small survey. It's only, I think, 4 questions. It shouldn't take long to complete. But it really helps support Conservation Nebraska, so we would really appreciate it if you would fill it out. Um, if anybody here wants to talk to a Conservation Nebraska member regarding conservation in Nebraska, or if you want to find out more about what we do, I'm gonna type the email address in the chat that you can use. Um, yeah. Okay. Tonight's presentation is about agrivoltaics. It can also be known as solar grazing. That's one form of it. And our speaker is John Hay from the Nebraska Extension Office. He's very cool, and he's very knowledgeable on it. Uh, so go ahead and take it away, John.
Thank you very much, Coda. Um, I, my kids don't think I'm cool, but that's okay. I'm cool as I can be. Welcome to the presentation today. We are going to have some questions at the end, so there'll be time for that. Type them in. If I see something important during, I'll present it. We're going to be talking about agrivoltaics, and in general, this is what I'm going to follow a little bit. I'm going to talk just a little bit about solar development. The what's going on in Nebraska with solar development. We're going to make sure we understand the definitions. We're going to talk about utility scale solar design a little bit, which helps us understand agrivoltaics. We're going to talk about look at what the research says about plant productivity under solar. We're going to talk about vegetation management contracts. That's the core of this right there is vegetation management and the contracts. And then we're going to just I'm going to finish with just my kind of musings a little bit about what I think are the future of agrivoltaics as that changes over time. We might have seen some solar developments in Nebraska. There's, maybe as many as 30 utility scale systems. Most are fairly small in communities, but there are some larger ones, like the one that's 30 acres west of Lincoln and the 500 acres southwest of Omaha, south of Utan. And there's a lot of projects proposed. And so this is the proposed projects. I went to the Southwest Power Pool interconnection queue and pulled up their dashboard that kind of lays out what are the proposed projects. So there are approximately 22,000 acres of projects proposed in Nebraska. The yellow ones here are solar. The purple ones are hybrid, meaning that they're going to add a battery to that location if they can. And
Oh,
so
sorry. Hold on, John.
I'm not
I don't
sharing
think
my
your
screen
presentation
yet,
is
am
up.
I? Get that done. One, share. Sorry about that. Here we are.
There we go.
Is that better? So, you got my review, which my review isn't all that interesting there, but there's my review of what we're talking about, and here is the things. Thank you for fixing that. So these are the sites. The yellow sites are solar. The purple sites are hybrid, meaning there's a battery. There are 22,000 acres of proposed projects, and maybe a bit more than that in Nebraska. But those don't necessarily mean all these are going to get built. This means that these projects are somewhere in that process. And so I'm sure, looking at this list, that there are some of these that, um, have different levels of chances of getting built, but they have to go through this interconnection queue, and so that's the best kind of list we have at the moment. And so the where I got this 22,000 acres is I took this about 3,100 acres or almost 3,200 acres of projects, and I decided that, or I looked up that a 1 megawatt of solar is approximately 5 to 7 acres. So I used 5 acres, and that led me to 22,000 acres approximately. We'll see what happens as these move forward and others get proposed as well. So, some definitions. Agrivoltaics is the combination of the word agriculture and the word photovoltaics, or PV. So agrivoltaics, solar and agriculture, and it really just is kind of a generic term meaning kind of anything that's done under there other than just maybe grass, any kind of agricultural practice. There have been a few terms come out that are more specific. Ecovoltaics, for one, is a term that's been thrown around. So again, kind of thinking about the word ecology or ecological practices and photovoltaics combined. So that might be growing native prairie plants, grasses, forbs, wildflowers, without or without grazing, or apiculture or bees would be ecovoltaics. So those terms, ecovoltaics is kind of a form of agrivoltaics, kind of nesting terms a little bit as we get specific. Solar grazing is sometimes used as a term as well, which would be grazing under solar. Typically, solar grazing in 2025 means sheep. In the future, we might add some other species, but generally, sheep are the most accepted and most used species for grazing. Solar honey is a term that's out there as well, where honeybees are produced. Honey is produced using honeybees in and around a solar that has this kind of prairie plantings or wildflower plantings. And so they're sometimes marketed as solar honey, and we see that a little bit. So I'm going to be using some of these terms. Really, I'm focusing on two things in this presentation. One is what's happening right now, the most common agrivoltaics, and then really doing a little bit of exploring about what might happen in the future. All right. So the American Farmland Trust has developed a definition for agrivoltaics. And so sometimes we need to kind of find a definition and kind of all agree on it. The Farmland Trust definition is pretty good, and a lot of people are kind of moving towards that definition. And they are basically suggesting that agrivoltaics projects have two key features: the production of marketable ag products throughout the full life of the solar array, and then an intentional design where that solar array is kind of designed so that it can be used for these agrivoltaic operations. And they use some specific language in there, and they're specifically trying to think about that system is built in a way that it's flexible enough so that that farmer there, if a farmer that's doing the vegetation management, can do different things over that project. That might be they hay it for a while, then they graze it, and then I might be able to move to different things. So that we'll kind of focus a little bit on that definition towards the end again, but just trying to help us understand what some of these organizations that are really interested in agrivoltaics are using for a definition. This is from a paper that and trying to kind of look at agrivoltaics in a cartoony way. But again, we're seeing a little bit of the ecovoltaics in the lower left, where we're have bees and sheep, and there's some native plantings, and then the other ones we're really seeing kind of agrivoltaics in different forms, and I'm going to talk about them some of these different forms a little bit more specific terms in a minute, but I think that there's a little bit of a challenge. I have a little bit of a challenge with this definition of agrivoltaics by looking at it like this, and I'll explain why here. I have a couple slides coming up. Imagine we're building a solar array and we are trying to maximize energy production. We're trying to make as much electricity as we can, and we're doing so because that has value, and we can make money at that. So we optimize the PV. We're going to have suboptimal agriculture. Anything we do on there is going to be suboptimal. And what I'm trying to say is that even if we're trying to graze sheep, think about trying to build a sub paddock using electric fence, and all these darn solar panels are in the way. It is suboptimal. That doesn't mean it's not doable. It doesn't mean it's not even that bad, but it's not optimal. And so that's part of the challenge we are facing when these people are trying to do agriculture within this solar array is it's just a challenging environment. So there's a lot of researchers out there saying, well, let's optimize agriculture and try to see how can we put solar in a agricultural field that we can do the agriculture. Well, guess what? Now we have suboptimal solar and suboptimal agriculture. The agriculture is easier, maybe, because we widened the spacing or we raised them up or we did this or that, but it's still suboptimal. I still have all these obstacles I'm dealing with. And so we're kind of challenged by that. Then let's say, oh, I know we're going to just optimize for both. Well, we're still then with suboptimal solar and suboptimal agriculture. Now, don't get me wrong that I'm not trying to attack this by saying suboptimal agriculture is all bad, that we shouldn't do it. I'm just saying that we need to recognize that really the where I personally see this going in the near term, in the long term, I don't know, but in the near term is in this upper left where we're going to still optimize for solar because that's where the money is. And we're going to try to find the the best agricultural opportunities we can while still optimizing for solar. And then slowly over time, we're going to move to the lower right, to the middle right there, and try to see how can we kind of, improve this so that ag gets a little easier, and we're still kind of optimizing for PV as best we can. And so kind of that finding that balance. I think that's the move, but I still think we got to stay in this upper left in the near term. This kind of reflects that a little bit. What you might be thinking and what the researchers are putting out there looks like this: raised up solar panels that are really high so we can run tractors underneath, solar panels that are spaced apart so we get lots of light so we don't have any real risk of lower production due to light. Vegetable production underneath the solar, and then this one on the far right here is kind of vertical solar, so we can actually drive down through the middle. I have some more information on that later. I think we think that that's what it looks like, but again, this is where I feel like all of those in that top row are kind of this suboptimal solar that I just don't see as maybe the majority of what's going to happen. What I think is going to happen in the near term is going to look like this, where we're optimizing for the solar. The solar panels are pretty close together. We might be grazing it. Definitely, there's going to be some mowing. Even if we're grazing it, we might do some mowing. Even if we're doing other activities like pollinators, we're going to be mowing because that mowing is still a critical part of keeping that down to the extent it needs to be down. We might mow less, but we're going to mow. And so then on the far right, again, is just another pollinator type of planting. It doesn't have quite as many flowers. I think that having one look like that one with all the flowers is going to be kind of ideal, while maybe more reality is this one on the right. And that still looks pretty darn good. I'm an agronomist, and I really kind of still kind of like that, but I know that there's a lot of forbs in there. They're just kind of hiding. Okay. What I hope for in the future is I would love to see, can we figure out a way to use cattle for part of that grazing? I think that'd be really interesting and really good for Nebraska because we don't have a lot of sheep. High value crops is always of interest because we can increase the value of that ag enterprise. Then this idea of trying to find that balance between ag and solar, it works better. Hay crops are being done in some places, and I think is going to be done more in the future. And then robots, and actually this picture with the mower there, that is actually a robotic mower that is commercially available in the solar industry today. It's made in Canada. So I had a picture of it. Okay, so here's kind of the way I'm thinking about economics that kind of details why I think we need to optimize for solar and although I love agriculture, I still think we need to optimize for solar because the money's where that is. So I took a 100-acre example. I said 100 acres of solar is approximately 20 megawatts AC of solar capacity. I estimated the production using a model out of the National Lab of the Rockies, which used to be called the Renewable Energy Lab until yesterday. And that product estimated the production at 43.5 gigawatt hours of energy generated annually. That value, I kind of used a range, a little bit of a range, thinking, did they get the tax credit or didn't they get the tax credit? Because we can still get the tax credit for another, year or so. I threw that in. So somewhere between $870,000 a year and 1.7 million. So we could round that to approximately $1 million a year for that 100 acres, or about $10,000 an acre of income. That's a gross income, not a net income, but that helps us understand what that might be making. This acre of corn, or these 100 acres of corn, might be a gross income of around 130 or $1,300 per acre, with a net of about 5,500 or 550, excuse me. So if we think about that, that solar is making a lot more money. And so then we think about trying to optimize for ag. If we optimize for ag, we invariably spread those apart. We have less solar generation. And so I just did some examples, and I said one of the examples actually came out about 30% reduction, but I used 20 in my example down here below. So if we try to maximize agriculture, we might have a reduction in our solar output. So a 20% reduction in the solar output would be less income of about $1,700 to $3,400. Well, that's more than that corn is worth. And so if we had a higher value crop, that might be more, we might be able to justify that a little bit better or something like that. But the reality is, in many cases, this is why we're maximizing for solar, is the value of that energy is very high per acre. We think about solar, 15, 20 years ago, the really common design was what's on the left hand or right hand side is a fixed tilt system that faces south. And so this doesn't move. There's no moving parts. And I have a pretty big area underneath that's shaded. And that's still very common at the very small scale. Like if I was doing a system for a farm or a business, a ground mount fixed tilt is still a very, very useful design. But as those systems have gotten to be utility scale and large, the one axis tracking have really taken over. And I'll give you some data why in a moment. But these track east to west. And so as we think about that, in the morning, they face east, and that's where they're facing it right now. And then they pivot on this point, and in the afternoon, they're going to be facing the west. And so they pivot. And so this shade moves through the day. And so it is not shaded all the time under there, and it's a narrower shade line, and that has some influence on the plant's ability to grow. And you can see there is grass across 100% of that area because there is enough light for some vegetation to grow and enough moisture to grow. This is a picture of the one east of Lincoln. So we think about that one axis tracker, it's going to just pivot across the pivot on that one axis through the day, and then at night it's going to come back. And then those posts are approximately maybe 21 to 25 feet apart, approximately, based on some of what I was looking at. There can be some variability in that, but that gives us enough space to drive a vehicle between, but not much more than that when we're trying to optimize for that solar. There's not a whole lot of concrete in these systems, essentially very, very little. These are simply posts driven into the ground very precisely, and they drive those in the ground. That's good because we don't need a lot of extra material. It's also good because when we pull them out, we're not doing a lot of, not leaving a lot in the ground, but there is a lot of them out there. So that's generally how these go together. Um, when we think about that one axis tracker, here is a single day on a one axis tracker. Don't worry about the colors. That's actually just three parts of the array, but we're looking at this kind of generation through an individual day. And if I take an individual day for a fixed tilt system, I'm actually going to get about 11% less on that given day. That might be a little more than that through the given year, but that's about once. I did do some modeling today, and that's actually was about what I came up with on the annual basis as well. And so it's about 11% less. And so this one axis tracking, it turns on earlier in the morning and later in the day because it's facing the sun all the time. And that's why that one axis tracker, its ability to produce more for the same amount of solar installed is why that one axis tracking has been important. It's not used in small scale because those moving parts break down and we have to have people to fix them. But at large scale, we have the maintenance crew. They're not a big maintenance crew, but there's enough to get that fixed. If it's my own home system, I want that thing to be fixed because I don't want to touch it. You know, I got it installed once and I should just let it sit. 1 megawatt is equal to about 5 to 7 acres. We kind of mentioned that earlier. And so then if I have a 100 megawatt system, I might have 500 acres or something like that. So just to give you a sense of the physical size of these, they tend to put a fence all around them and nobody inside the fence without permission. And so this is a one axis tracker kind of from above we're looking at here. Let's look at some of that grass productivity. I looked at some data from a number of studies, but then I kind of came back to this one because it had really good graphics and I kind of liked it. And I think that it represents at least most the results are similar to a lot of stuff that's happening from kind of the Rockies east. Some of the stuff in the Southwest United States less applicable to us, but they come up with some different numbers a little bit because of their extreme dry conditions. So what we're looking at here is the soil water content throughout the year based on these different colors on that, but they're all kind of the same shape in general. But what essentially we're seeing is that the moisture content between the panels is pretty high, and we can kind of call that almost like a control. And then right directly under the pole, under the panel, close to the pole, we're having some dip in the soil moisture content. Now, the other thing that we're seeing happen in the research is that that area directly under the post is also shaded a bit more of the time, and we're going to see that in the next slide. Thus, it actually has less evaporation. So the plants don't have a reduction in growth in that area as much as you'd think. A little bit, but not as much as you'd think because they have less evaporation, so the water stays there better, but it is a little bit less. But in the middle, it's pretty normal. Sunlight is, remember that shade moves across the sky through the day. And so what we're kind of seeing is that if the sun in the morning, and we can draw the sun in the morning is kind of hitting in this area of the solar. So these are the solar panels right up here. I'm going to clear my screen here. The solar panels are there. that's getting some, this area here then is getting morning sun. This area here is getting afternoon sun. This area through the middle is getting all day sun or sun during the middle of the day. And so we can kind of see that most we're getting pretty good sun through most of that area, but we're really, if we're missing any sunlight, it again is right near the poles. That's where we're kind of missing the most. But generally, for most crops, there is sufficient sunlight to get decent yields through under these solar arrays. There are a few crops that are more sensitive to solar that or to sunlight that don't do as well, and that would be ones we would, if you were going to grow them, you'd need to plant them more in the middle of between the rows, and that's more of the vegetable crops. The grasses and the and things do pretty well through there. There might be some sensitivity to some warm season grasses in the closer to the pole. And so that's kind of generally what we're seeing. But cool, this study was done with cool season grasses, and we're going to see the yield on that here in this slide. Now, this slide looks like the yields are very different, but we have to remember what we learned in statistics class, and that if the letters are the same, they're not statistically different. And so there is only one statistically different data point on this slide, and that is here. And that is actually a little bit of a dynamic of where these were in the world, and that these were outside of Denver area and in Colorado, and they get a lot of morning rain. And so what was happening in that morning rain, that was facing east, and then that water would drip off right there. So they got quite a bit of extra moisture due to those morning rains, and that was a little bit higher. So I don't think that necessarily will be seen in all locations. But what we're seeing though is we likely have lower yields right next to the pole, but statistically they weren't different. And so if we were out there physically looking at it on any given day, we may not really notice that difference because it's when they actually harvest that, they were not able to tell the difference based statistically. So generally, we're seeing pretty good yields through that whole area with maybe a dip right along the post. Okay, let's move towards those contracts. So I wanted to kind of understand the solar development ecosystem, shall we say, in Nebraska and the United States. Most commonly, private companies or utilities, private companies are more common even than utilities, own and operate the solar array. That's the most common situation we see. And in Nebraska, that one west of Lincoln is owned by a company, and they just sell the power to Lincoln Electric Systems. The one south of Utan, 500 acres, is owned by a company, and they have a contract to sell that to OPPD. So they sell the electricity to the utility or the electrical market, and then that company contracts with another individual or company to do the vegetation management. So there's a second person doing the vegetation management. So I'm trying to get at is that the landowner and the vegetation management aren't usually the same people. They could be, but mostly they're not. Usually, at least in the status quo system we have today, it's just some mowing company that they hired that is going to mow it. Less common, but still does happen. We have the landowner or the farmer or a business owns the solar array, and they might use that electricity locally. They might sell it to other businesses. They might sell it to utilities or sell it to the electrical marketplace. Then they would then have to have a plan because they own it and operate it. They would have to have a plan for their own vegetation management. And that might allow them to have some more flexibility because they're making all those decisions and not some company. So they might be able to do some more flexible things. Also, sometimes I see these, and because they're a little smaller, that allows for kind of more opportunities. You can imagine if you say, we're going to raise, I don't know, let's just throw out one I haven't thought of before, but like we're going to raise pumpkins on this. Well, raising pumpkins on, a 4 acre patch might be a different, scenario than trying to do that on 500 acres. And so vegetation management, as things get big, has to be able to deal with that scale. And so sometimes vegetables don't necessarily do well at that scale. So we have to be those these less common, smaller ones might have some flexibility, is what I'm suggesting. And I've seen that in some systems throughout the United States. The state of the industry of vegetation management. Remember that company owns it. They're hiring a company to do vegetation management. The state of the industry is to mow or spray that, or mow and then maybe do a little bit of spot spraying 2 to 4 times a year. So I said 2 to 4 because maybe in western Nebraska it only gets 12 to 14 inches of rain, central Nebraska 20 inches of rain, eastern Nebraska 30. So as if this is an eastern Nebraska project, we might have to mow that 4 times. If this is a western Nebraska project, we might be able to get away with mowing it only 2 times. Generally, cool season grasses or maybe some warm season if we're out west, depending on the size of the grass. Native mixes could be possible, forbs, flowers. Those are all kind of still the state of the industry. Pretty common to see situations with either cool season grasses or kind of native mixes. It's also pretty common to see mowing grazing systems. And I call it a mowing grazing system because a majority of the solar grazers that I've talked to, and I've talked to solar grazers from a couple different states, including Ohio and Kentucky and Virginia, and they all use what they call a mowing grazing system, where they're trying to get the sheep to do as much of the work as possible, but because they're in the eastern half of the United States, that the rain comes in the spring and they get a flush of growth, and there's just a lot of growth that happens very fast, and to have the number of animals needed to keep that down is very difficult because later in the season they don't need that many animals to keep the vegetation down, so they tend to do some mowing in the early season to keep that at bay, and then they use sheep the rest of the season to keep that with some kind of touch-ups. Cool season grasses, native mixes are also common. So let's talk about those contracts just a little bit. This vegetation management contract is an agreement that defines how the vegetation management is done. And so it's going to say something like, and I pulled this directly from an example contract that I saw, the company doing the vegetation management will maintain a vegetation height 24 inches below the solar panels in a horizontal position for one-axis tracking systems. And then it went on to say 12 inches for fixed tilt systems. So 24 inches below. So if you think about if that solar panel in its horizontal position is at, let's just say 6 feet off the ground, then you could have something that was up to 24 inches below that. It's probably not quite 6 feet. It might actually be 5 feet. And so 24 inches below that is where I have to keep that down. So to keep that vegetation down, I have to think about species, obviously. I can't be planting big blue stem and letting it grow to full height, or Indian grass or things like that. But I could be planting things like blue grama grass or side oats for those natives and keep that a little lower. There are people that know a lot more about those mixes than are familiar with what works best for those mixes. But I'm just kind of thinking through the idea. So I need to think about, how am I going to keep that down? Am I going to mow it? Am I going to graze it? What am I going to do to keep that below 24 inches? Methods, that agreement is going to dictate the methods of management. It may not just say you can do anything. It's going to say you can do mowing, spraying, grazing with sheep, haying, maybe it'll say crops, but it's going to dictate that. And it may say, you can't do cattle or something like that. So it's going to dictate in what that means. Who can be inside the fence, what PPE they have to wear, what are the monetary terms, how much they get paid, the communication requirements, like do I have to communicate when I go out there, things like that. So let's move into some of these different types. Let's talk about solar grazing for a moment. In this case, we'll call that a sheep rancher. Their contract is to do vegetation management, and they want to use sheep to do some of that management. So we can't, they tend to not just put sheep out into a big paddock because the sheep will just eat what they like and they'll leave the rest and it won't be knocked down enough. So you mob grazing is really the way to go, and they'll use temporary fence. In this case, you can see electrical fence in the foreground of that picture on the right, and they're making those sheep in a fairly small space so that they eat that down lower so that then they move them to the next spot and they consistently move them through the array until it's all grazed, and by that time you start over and go around again. They also again are doing some mowing to touch up. Those pictures came from Texas Solar Sheep, which is an organization out of Texas that grazes a lot. In a solar grazing contract, so there's kind of a vegetation management portion of the contract, and then they'll go into these kind of sub parts of the contract that detail the solar grazing. The master service agreement is kind of this service agreement that dictates this is what we expect on all the different paddocks and all the different sites that you're working on. Each individual site may have a statement of work that very much details that location a little bit more and what's needed at that location. There might be also additional riders that might detail the what's needed for fencing, signage, security, things like that. I have a longer presentation on solar grazing. I just did the highlights. So for this shorter presentation. Outside the fence, visitors, internal fencing, dogs, vehicles, pesticides, things like that. Considerations, I'm not going to touch on this in great detail, but insurance, access, communication, the fact that you're going to have, a sheep school for all of the employees so they know how to deal with sheep or stay away or whatever the case may be. The grazing plan, water is really important. If we're going to graze this, we got to have water. Who's providing that? And that's going to have to be figured out. Sheep ready. So this is the idea that if we're going to go to a site and do solar grazing and get a solar grazing contract, is that site sheep grazing ready? So what seed mix was used and planted? Is the perimeter fence adequate? Is there water? Is there proper gates, etc.? Is it cattle ready? Cattle ready is similar to sheep, except we might have some extra work to make sure that the conduit is not leaving gaps where the cows can stick their heads through. They armor sensitive equipment. That's what one of the companies that does some cattle grazing says. They armor. They take fencing and put it around things that are sensitive. And then cattle drink a lot of water, so it's really critical to figure out the water situation. Hay production. This is a site at Ohio State where they have cooperation with a company where they have 100 acres of commercial utility scale solar that they are doing hay production. They're doing a mix of, they're doing alfalfa, but also some cool season grasses and some other locations. It's all replicated and they'll have some good data. They actually just finished year 2 and their conclusions are that the production level was not different inside the array compared to a control planting that was outside of the array. So they had very similar yields of hay across that. So that's good news so that we can kind of know what to expect from a yield standpoint. They're using commercially available hay equipment, small but commercially available. Some concerns that they've identified in Ohio are compaction of soils during construction and damage to soil drainage systems. We have less concerns about that second one because we don't have as many drainage systems, but still important to think about. They talk about making the site hay ready. What does hay ready mean? That means that that company is barrowing the wires between the rows so that the equipment, because sometimes they'll build a cable tray and it'll cross between the rows. Well, that's great, except for now the tractor can't get through there and it can't turn around. It better not even go in there. So they need to be burying those in those hay ready sites if we're going to hay it. They need to give appropriate space so the tractor can turn around at the end of the row and doesn't hit the fence. They need to ensure the land, if they're doing any land leveling, we got to make sure that topsoil is put back on so we have some fertility in that soil. And then obviously planting before installation is preferred. That's beyond the scope of this presentation, but good uh, vegetation establishment is really going to be critical. We're getting close to the end, so I'm not bad on time, and then we'll get to questions. This is a vertical bifacial solar, sometimes called solar fences. Bifacial means that these solar panels can actually get sunlight from either side. Two-sided solar, and they actually are installing bifacial in a lot of the single axis trackers as well. This it seems very exciting, and I actually am reasonably excited about this, but I also recognize some of its limitations. If I'm going to put this in a field, I can farm this field, and I could farm it with soybeans for sure, maybe corn if I use if it was a little shorter, or if these panels were tall enough, or if I use some of that new short stature corn. I'm not sure how short that is yet. I haven't seen a field of it yet. But again, I can do agriculture here, but it's still suboptimal in the sense that now I'm farming around these obstacles. That's still a challenge in and of itself. And what does it do to the solar production? So then I did some modeling today, and I came up with this where I modeled a one-axis tracker. I kind of called that my comparison. Everything's relative to that. So I made the production of that one-axis tracker 100% just to compare. And then I compared that to a fixed tilt, which we saw earlier, 89%, and then this vertical bifacial, 67%. I used the same location, the same solar capacity, and the same panel on all three. And these are the numbers I came up with. So if we're going to lose 33%, are we gaining enough ag to make that worth it? Well, maybe, maybe not. But that's where I find that this vertical very interesting. But I'm also think we got to figure out how the money works out when it produces less. It's also potentially not producing at the time of day that's most desired, which is right in the middle of the day. That may be another issue. We'll see. So I'm going through these alternative architecture, and this is one of my last slides. So one of the things I hear people say is, well, for cattle, we have to raise them up. Well, that's a good idea. But my question is that really required? I think we need to do a little more work with cattle and decide if cattle are going to work. But raising them up would be one way that we could be more confident about cattle. But I'm not sure it's going to be required or not. Also, I'm not sure what the cost is. I know it'll cost more because there's more steel, so it's going to cost more. But how much more, I don't know. So that'll be interesting to see. This is a solar array in Colorado where he has, it's a small personally owned one, and some of his are raised up. So this front edge is about 6 foot off the ground, which is much higher than normal. So that's where that picture came from. It's just taller than a regular one. Here's what I'm thinking about for the future as we finish the last slide, and I'll start looking at questions. I'd really love to see farmers working with solar developers to plan a project which will minimize problems that arise between so that ag production can happen. We're maximizing the ag under the solar, and kind of getting together and saying, what's the best of both worlds? How do we get that done? I would love to see in Nebraska the cattle grazing become an option because I think that would really open up some opportunities for some cattlemen. I really think about young cattlemen saying, well, if I could get this contract, and remember, it's still a vegetation management contract, so they'll pay me to graze my cattle. And that could be a way for a young farmer that doesn't have access to land to access land and get their kind of their farm started. High value crops, I think, are would be exciting, would be interesting, and I do think that there's room in the world for these unique designs. I don't want you to come across that John said these designs are bad, higher up or vertical. I didn't say that. I think there might be room for them. I think we have to figure out, how that's going to work. I think some of those are going to be maybe the ones that are individually owned, where they're making choices based on what they want this to do, versus just trying to optimize the solar production. Solar shades for cattle, raised solar, vertical solar are examples of that. So with that, I'm going to leave this on here for just a second, and I'm going to start looking at some of these questions. And I think Kodo is going to read some.
Yeah. Wow, that presentation was really informative. And you did a great job on time. I'm very appreciative of that. I'm going to have my wonderful colleague Sam start the survey while I read out some of these questions for you, um, just for our Conservation Nebraska metrics. Uh, I'm going to start with the chat. Bill says, I am just now developing a soul apiary project. Who do I communicate with at the Nebraska Extension office?
Well, that's a good question. Solar is it solar apiary project? I'm gonna get my
Yeah,
brain. Um,
but that's bees, I think.
yes. I think I am one of them, but then for bees, the UNLB lab with Judy Woo Smart is who would be a really good contact. Um, and that would be a really good person to communicate with. We are going to kind of do a presentation together in Auburn on February the 5th. So you could look for that, where Judy Woo Smart and I are going to be talking about solar and bees a little bit. So that's really exciting. That's really fun. I'd love to hear from you. Judy Woo Smart. You'd have to look. I have to look that up. Two words. W
Uh,
Smart. Yeah.
Dan says, when we use the term agrivoltaics, are we already assuming that there is a loss or less than optimal production of both ag and solar? In other words, is the combination always going to be less than each alone?
No, I don't think so. I think no, I don't think so. Because I would consider sheep grazing agrivoltaics, and sheep can be grazed under solar with the standard architecture that maximizes solar production as high as it can be, as high as much energy as can be generated from that site. And so I think there are some opportunities to call agrivoltaics that. What I work, because I don't want agrivoltaics to be this kind of it's kind of the negative of both. Um, I personally think that's why I've been kind of saying today a little bit that I'd love, or that I think in the near term, agrivoltaics is going to focus on activities that can be done under the standard architecture. And then over time, and that might be the next 4 or 5 years, as we move in, maybe we'll get more excited about things that where we are willing to sacrifice on one or the other to try to maximize agriculture, or sacrifice solar to do agriculture, or maybe we'll find a way that we can still maximize solar and do new types of agriculture. Maybe raising those up doesn't cost very much, and we can start doing some of that. I think there is some opportunity. I think there might. I read one thing in one place where they thought maybe they could just increase the tilt angle so that they could become vertical temporarily. And I thought that could
Mm.
be exciting. So just there's going to be some new ideas out there. So I don't think that that's universally true, but I do think that there are people that are thinking that way. Yes.
So, this next question is you kind of already just answered it. But she's wondering, do you think solar over ag will continue to be the best option in the future and continue to have a higher return on investment?
Well, I think that the we need to understand we need to think if I'm thinking about, let's say they're proposing a solar project in near my community or near my home. I want you to understand that the fallback position is going to be to plant a perennial like a cool season grass and mow it 4 times a year. That's the fallback position. That's kind of like the we won't call it the worst case scenario, but that scenario is still not terrible. It's still good for the soil because we have a perennial. It's still making the money from the solar, but it isn't as optimal as it could be. And that's where this agriculture idea is, I think, gaining a lot of traction to say, how can we make that a little more optimal? And the solar industry is actually interested in it too, because if they do a contract, let's say for solar grazing, that that grazer, that rancher is recognizing that they're getting some value for their sheep, for those lambs that are coming off, and that maybe they can bid for that contract a little lower, so the company pays them a little bit less, and thus the company's happy. The company wants wants agrivoltaics for that reason, but they also want it for the reason of they don't want to be seen as a negative for agriculture. And they want to try to build up this agrivoltaics. So I do think that agrivoltaics is going to be pushed for going forward, but I think we have to recognize that, okay, I gave this contract to the grazing person, and that grazing person decided to get out of sheep, but they kept the contract. They may just mow it, right? We have to understand what the fallback position is, and that fallback position is not great, but it's not all bad.
All right. What differentiates small and large scale? And do you have any specific examples of large scale companies using agrivoltaics in Nebraska right now?
Yes, and yes. I tend to say that really anything above about an acre is large scale. I know that's kind of weak. But what I think about is we have small scale that might be, you know, half an acre or something like that. And then we get to this 1 to maybe 10 acre size. And I kind of call that community solar. There is kind of this term community solar. It has other definitions, but maybe that 1 to 10 acre size. And then you get above 10 acres and it's utility scale. So there's not a real true definition, but that's the way I kind of think about it. In some ways, is large scale is over an acre, but really over 10 acres is utility scale. But what we're seeing today is most of these projects are 100 acres to as much as 3,000 acres. So those are that's what we're seeing proposed right now is these very large projects. And then what was the second half of the question? I forgot already. It was,
Do you have any specific examples of large scale companies doing
yes,
agrivoltaics in Nebraska?
I do. The project south of Utan that's 500 acres is owned by a company called AES, and they have contracted with a rancher that has a ranch in Atkinson, Nebraska, and that rancher is going to bring down sheep to graze that, starting, he thinks, the summer of 26, this next summer. It just got finished before this past summer, and things were still kind of getting started. So I think it just got mowed this last year, but they are planning to bring sheep down and graze that starting next summer. That would be our first real agrivoltaics project. I think there are some examples of this ecovoltaics a little bit in places in Nebraska where they've planted some pollinator habitat, and that's good, but it doesn't lend itself to that next level of income, right? Where we're actually getting income from that, that we're just having kind of ecological, you know, ecological services. But yes, so that one by south of Utan will be grazed next summer. That'll be our first real agrivoltaics project in Nebraska. And I am hoping, cross my fingers, everything works out, that we'll do a tour of that at some time next summer. So we'll be letting people know about that.
I'm gonna have to watch out for that. Um, do solar panels leach any contaminants into the soil?
No and yes. And this is where it gets complicated. The answer in general is no. Though there has been some studies, and I want to explain that because the research there's been some research that makes the yes answer come out, right? So what they did is that if a solar panel, let's say, got hit um, uh, by hail, large hail, like what happened out in Scotts Bluff, they get broken, and then the idea is that what's in them could leach into the soil, but what's in them is a solid, not a liquid, and so it's not necessarily leaching. But they did a study, and this is where this comes into play. They did a study where they ground up a solar panel, and they put a acidic liquid on that was like the leachate from a landfill. And then they collected what came off of that, and some of the heavy metals like lead. Sometimes a little bit of lead in some of those, and some of those things did leach out in that leachate. And so then the idea is they leach toxic materials, but the reality is only when exposed to acidic conditions or conditions that are like a landfill, and then only if that landfill were improperly built, where it actually we lost that liquid and it left the landfill site, which it shouldn't do. So in improper disposal, there is a risk. In the case of a farm, they're not seeing that. If they were to break, what likely is to happen is that a little bit of glass gets ended up on the ground. They try to do as best they can to suck some of that up, which is what they did in Scotts Bluff. They used a big giant industrial vac and they sucked some of that glass up, and then they sent those panels for recycling. So the panels and all the chemicals with the panels left the site, so there were no chemicals to leach. So kind of answers your question. I can send you those studies if that would help.
Our next question is, can solar pair with CRP? I don't know what that stands for.
It stands for Conservation Reserve Program. It's a federal program where they pay you to not use row crops and to plant usually a pollinator mix over a period of time. And the answer is no and yes. You have to pay to take it out of CRP, and likely the company would pay that. Now, here's the interesting part. Could you leave some of the vegetation material there and put the solar in? That's a maybe. It really depends on exactly what's out there. But it the answer is no, because you have to take it out of CRP. But the reality is, where I said yes, is that you could pay, and that is an option. A lot of times the company will offer to pay to get you out of that contract so that the solar can go on.
All right. Wow, we have a lot of questions. Somebody is wondering, will hemp be a high value crop in Nebraska?
John Hay answer only. No. But that's John Hay's answer. I don't see that there being a big market for that. I do think that there will be a market for a few select people that might be able to get into that marketplace. But I don't think that that's going to be a big thing. That's just my take. We'll see what happens. I'm not opposed to it. I'm just not necessarily seeing it.
Uh, are there financial grants or loans for agrivoltaics at the state and or federal level?
No, not specifically, no. There might be some ways to there might be some things out there, but nothing that I can think of specifically for agrivoltaics, no.
Do particularly large arrays create a heat island effect?
I have not, I'm going to answer that in a way that may not be ideal. I have not seen that in the research. I haven't looked for it specifically, but I have not seen it in the research.
All right, we're almost there.
No problem.
Is agrivoltaics socially acceptable in local communities?
I think we're going to find that out. Um, I can tell you that when a large solar array is proposed, there are people that have opposition, and for many reasons. And I talk to those people and talk about their reasons, and those reasons are theirs, and some of those reasons have good well thought out backing, and other times it's more just not wanting to look at it. That's okay. That's okay as well. But so there's these people that are challenged by it, and that's fine. I'm not trying to. They have that. They have that. I'm not trying to promote solar per se either. I'm trying to understand these systems and opportunities and what's happening. And so, is agrivoltaics going to change their mind? That's going to be where it's going to be interesting to see if when we're doing ag on that as well as solar, do they see it differently? I don't know yet. I think that'll be really interesting to find out. Um, I imagine it could help because some of the challenges to say we're taking land out of production. Well, if my neighbor Bob has that contract and he's doing some level of ag in there, that still feels like at least some level of ag production. So I do think that it could have some impact. We'll see what happens.
All right. I'm just going to give a final reminder for the survey because it is 7 o'clock. I'm going to continue fielding the questions if, John, you're okay with that. There are a few more to get through, and then there's a couple sitting in the Q&A as well.
Yeah, yeah, I'm fine if I just answer the questions.
All right. Are the batteries for storing energy associated with solar a big concern for contamination?
I think some of that is going to be. Um, I think generally the answer is no. I mean, this is a lithium ion battery, and we carry these around in our pockets, and so we need to develop a system for recycling. These large scale batteries, the good news is everything's all in one place. We can put them on a pad. We can monitor them. There are some other battery technologies. Actually, Lincoln is putting in a battery that has a different technology than lithium ion or different chemistry. And they're putting that actually in town, I think, so they're not as worried about it. And so that's good. But no, I don't think we're real worried about it. But the reality is that, any battery has this is electrical has so we need to pay attention to things like fire and just be prepared for that eventuality. The good news about solar in some ways is all that stuff is inside a fence and people are separated from it. And if there is an issue, let's say there is a fire, we don't love that, but we could stand back and keep the people away from it, which would be good. I think the risk of fire is low, but you never say zero. But I think that I don't think there's a real contamination issue as long as we're disposing of those batteries properly at the end of their life, which again is what we hope is happening or will happen, or recycling.
Uh,
That's really nice.
this is the last question in the chat. How do we find out if projects might be upcoming for land we own?
Okay, that's tougher because generally the way it's worked is that companies are kind of looking at the map and they're looking at a couple things. They're looking at who might be the buyer and where can they put electricity on the grid? And then they're kind of saying, well, we think we can put electricity on the grid for a low price over by this power line, over by this substation. And so then they start kind of looking at that area and they begin contacting landowners. So what kind of happens is that if you've been contacted, you know that they're interested in your area. If you haven't been contacted, you may or may not be even close, right? They may not ever come to your land. There are a few examples, very few, but a few examples where landowners kind of made phone calls and tried to get people interested in their land because they were interested in the income from that. I think that that's you have at least some chance that nothing happens from that, and it's maybe a small chance that somebody kind of takes you up on that. But in general, I don't. There isn't a good way to find out if you haven't been contacted by a company already.
All right. We're almost there. People have a lot to say.
Oh, good.
Uh,
Good
can
questions.
we can we implement this in an agricultural town of around 50,000 people if we have sustainable land in town?
I'm struggling with this question a little bit. I'm not sure quite how to answer it. Um, I really think that okay, let's go back to this town idea. A lot of these communities in Nebraska that have community solar projects that the project is either owned by the community or owned by the utility or maybe even a private owner, but they're selling to the community. Those tend to be kind of smaller solar arrays, 10 acres to maybe 50 acres. But these would be really, to me, very fun sites for agrivoltaics. And I think it would be really good because you could get somebody to do something more interesting than just mow it, right? Because it's not a big space. I might be able to raise part of it in one vegetable and do a little hay on the other side of it, or I might be able to just mow part of it and do vegetables on part of it. I can do more unique things because it's not a great big space that might overwhelm the person doing the vegetation management contract. But again, some of that's how long, who has the contract now? If the solar hasn't been built, there'll be a new contract in the future. But who has a contract now? When does that expire? And can we recruit a person to do something unique with that in the next round? So I don't think that the city size makes as big a difference there. If you're thinking about solar generating for a city, we shouldn't necessarily think about it that way. Solar goes onto the grid, and then the grid and all of the other generation, including the solar, provides energy for a city. So we could put a solar array right next to the city, and that solar array could be providing electricity for the city down the road. Not it, who's where's the electricity flowing at that moment? It isn't necessarily for an individual place, but the contracts on paper are for an individual place. So that's where that gets confusing.
The next question is, are electricians promoting solar throughout Nebraska, in both rural and urban areas?
I would say electricians are not necessarily the ones that are doing any of the promotion. And this is actually nothing for or against electricians. Electricians are kind of, most of them are doing their thing and there's plenty of work to do. There are some electricians that are interested in small scale solar and doing some work with that. And obviously, these large scale systems are going to have electricians do that work, but likely as part of a bigger company that is doing that work. So I don't think electricians are doing a whole lot of the promotion. I know but I do think they're a critical part of this. But most of them that I've experienced with electricians are mostly just kind of, there's plenty of work, so they're just doing whatever work's coming their way. So if you had a specific follow up on that, I could help a little bit more. But
This, do you have studies on how we can implement structure of the 30 by 30 plan? I don't know what that is.
I'm thinking the 30 by 30 plan is the 30% renewables by the year 3030, but I'm not sure. The 30 by 30, there was a 25 by 25 plan. I'm not 100% sure. Um, but those, if I'm thinking right, I have to look up 30 by 30. But if this was the 30% renewables by 2030, these plans are just ideas more than they are plans. And we have to have our governments grab hold of those plans if this is going to help. And some states have done that, some haven't. But interestingly, Nebraska has not been one of them that did any of that planning, but has actually got quite a bit of renewables because the price of renewables has been low, and we've installed quite a bit because of that. Um, Yes, this I'm going to read this question. With the shade right beneath the solar, evaporation should be less, leading to water content be higher there, but the soil water content graph says the opposite. That's absolutely right, and I'm going to just give you a little bit of help on that. The data that there has been some data out of Oregon that suggests exactly what you said, where under the soil with less evaporation, they actually saw higher water content, and that's also been true in the kind of the spring and the fall when there's a little more rain. That particular study, because it was done on the western shortgrass prairie of eastern Colorado, because that's really, I think, the answer to why it was a little bit different, and we saw a little bit. They just don't get as much rain. They have very low humidity, and so I think just the fact that less rain was falling directly under, they saw a little bit less. So that was really an effect of where it was done. I think you might see a little different in a different place. That was a good observation. How will
All
this
right,
affect,
last question.
how will this affect tax valuations for ground developed for solar and adjacent farms? Okay, this is a really good question. And I'm going to answer it not by tax. Oh, well, let's do tax. Let's do tax valuations. The ground under the solar. So the solar is on this piece of property. That solar under state law is not considered is that land is no longer considered ag, it's considered commercial. And so if there is a difference in tax valuation, that tax valuation will rise, but the developer will pay that. Every contract I've seen or heard about, they pay the difference. So the landowner still pays the farm valuation price of the land underneath, and then the developer pays any difference between that and what's actually charged if it goes up. So, and then the adjacent land is still agricultural land and it's normal. But your question might go, let's go to a house. What is the sale value of a house next door? Now that house used to look over a cornfield. Now it looks over a solar farm. Does that value of that house, the selling price or the value of the house, go down? The studies are variable, but generally they show a small increase of 2 to 5%, particularly in the first years after that solar goes in. And then there are some studies that have shown that it's not different a few years later. There's some studies that saw no difference. So there is some variability, but there is, at least in the near term, there are some studies that are showing a 2 to 5% decrease in valuation of those properties that are very close to the solar. And then as you get farther away, quarter mile, half mile, 1 mile, those differences go away. So that's what some of the studies have shown. Maybe, so I don't know which question quite you were asking, but I kind of answered two different ones there, but that's okay.
Wow. I'm pretty sure we don't have any more questions. Thank you so much for presenting with us. I'm amazed at how much you know. I'm really excited to see what you're doing in the future and how agrivoltaics will develop in Nebraska. Um, thank all of the participants for coming. Yeah, thank everybody so much. This concludes the webinar, I guess.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.